Hey guys, how's it going? This is Thomas. I did a little demo for you guys, and it's based on this week's weekly challenge. It's the mech robot. So, being me, I love environments, decided to throw it into an environment and turn into a little demo just showing atmospheric lighting and just showing how to break down your value system and a little bit of color palette breakdown. Just as a preface, this painting is a little bit more speed painterly, meaning I'm just doing this for fun, and hopefully you guys learn some stuff about painting, but this is not what I would use for production art or for any kind of student or school work, just because it's not organized enough. But let's get started. So I started with a line drawing, and I focused a lot on just getting the shapes I wanted, starting with big shapes, then medium shapes, then small shapes. And I left the background a little bit loose on purpose. That's okay. We'll fix that later on. But what I did want to get was that robot in the foreground that I just blocked in silhouette. So a lot of people ask me how I start with my color palettes. And I usually start with the opposite of the colors I want to use. One of the things I do a lot of the times is using reference or just whatever's in my head. I know I want to start with a green or muted base, a green or muted palette for this painting. So naturally, I went with the opposite undertone, and when those flecks of red show up underneath the green painting or yellow painting, it's going to give it a little bit of vibrancy and something to play off of rather than just all being green, gray, and desaturated. So blocked in my line, blocked in my background color, and you can see I threw in some crazy strokes in the background to get started. And that again, that's just strokes that'll show up little bits here and there in the final painting, and it just gives it a little bit more life and breathing room. I'm blocking in the major buildings right now as well. So I've got this main center building that's my robot is overlapping in the foreground, and kind of these buildings I'd consider them all like middle ground. You can see I've done all the big shapes, and I've kind of planned out what the light side and shadow side of each of them is going to be. The light side right now is kind of dark, and originally I was planning to have this piece more backlit, but I decided to front light it a little bit more, as you guys will see later on, or side light actually. So to get the colors right, I did my original painting, and then I switched to a color balance layer. So I made an adjustment layer that's a black and white half circle at the bottom of your layer box. And what you want to do is hit that, go to color balance, and you can play around to get the exact colors you want. And then I started painting over again on top of this. And this whole painting is very loose, and at the same time, I'm not using any fancy brushes, not worrying about textured brushes, because that's just going to come towards the end, you know. And again, it's a big, medium, and a small process. So I'm working up the big stuff first, then I'm going to start on the mediums pretty soon. As you can see, I have my general lighting, and I have my atmosphere at the top, kind of fading into the clouds. The buildings are fading away, and then as they move back in space, atmospheric perspective, all the particles in the air are going to catch light, and there's going to be a smog, that haze that you probably love in Los Angeles. So here I'm using the same process we did in the class. I'm using a clipping mask on top of the silhouette of the robot, and I'm just blocking in the shadow sides and the light sides. And again, I'm always concerned about that main read, right? That 1, 2, 3 read. Is everything gonna be very clear and easy for the viewer to understand? Yes. If the answer is no, I have to make a change. So after that, I'm starting to play a little bit with the sky color right here, and what I've done is introduce that yellow slash green, and I've also turned off my line layer. I feel like I've got enough of a painting in right now that I can just go with that, and I don't need to worry about my line layer anymore. That just got me started. So I turned off my line layers and played with the sky a little bit, introducing that extra color in there. And so I'm bouncing between this, desaturated brown, that reddish light that's coming from the sky, red and yellow, and then a little bit of green and yellow in the clouds in the sky, just to play these colors off one another. And red and green are complementary colors, so they naturally fight against each other. But if you use them well and use them with a little bit of gray and playing other colors off of them, your colors will start to sing together because it's like harmony. We can get more into that later on. So as you can see right now, I'm starting to go into the medium shapes. So I'm pushing those buildings further and further back with atmosphere and just overlaying levels of clouds and smog in front of them. And again, because it's an organic process, the shapes are changing, and you can see me getting slightly more detail on that building on the right, breaking the shapes down from big shapes to big and mediums, and later on we'll add the smalls. And again, I use an additive process for this whole painting, so I'm just building layer on top of layer on top of layer on top of layer, and it's not the cleanest way to work, but it's actually a lot like acrylic painting for me, where if I mess up in an acrylic painting, there's no going back, there's no erasing, so I just paint on top of whatever's there. For these building slats, what I'm doing is just holding down shift and making straight lines and evenly spacing them out just by eye, and then warping them into the right perspective. And even here, I'm getting a little bit loose over the brush strokes, and that's totally fine. If you guys look at the work of somebody like Craig Mullins or one of my friends, Ahmed Al-Duri, does a bunch of tutorials online, you'll see that they break down like an illustrator would, the simplest shapes first, and then get everything to read in big brush strokes. They're not trying to get into the details by zooming in all the way. And you can see even in the way I'm painting right now, I'm painting at a distance. This isn't taking up much of my screen, and I'm trying to focus on the overall picture, not any small detail yet. One thing I'm doing here is just adding brush strokes. One way you can do that for flat surfaces is to make a block with your marquee tool and then just put a bunch of brush strokes in there, and that'll give you a bunch of variance, and then you can add that, you can warp that into perspective as I did with the roof tile on top. I've also added in that light in the foreground that's going to hit that robot later on. You can see that little light in the bottom right corner. The painting here starts to look a little bit like a mess because I'm just throwing these brush strokes. It seems random almost, but it's more that I'm putting them in areas of shadow mostly, and areas of light are kind of staying flatter, and then those brush strokes, I just drop the opacity on them so that they would disappear. If you guys saw that little silhouette on top of the robot, he just disappeared because he'll come back later. I wasn't feeling too good about the placement of it right then, so again, because it's an organic process, I said, you know what, I'll come back to that in a second. Let me figure this robot out and figure out where I want the viewer to look. Who's the star of my image? It's got to be this guy. Even though the background's nice to look at and stuff, the star of the image has got to get all the love. So if your painting's focused on one idea, you want your viewer looking there first. And so you can see right now the darkest areas of contrast, the areas of darkest shadow and highest light are on this robot, and he's also getting all the love of the smaller details as well. So it's helpful to think about your painting in terms of, big and mediums and smalls, but when it comes down to areas of focus, you want to get those smalls. You can start zooming in, like I did with, the eye of that robot. And you guys could see some of the reference pictures I had up there for a second. A lot of them are smoggy and cityscapes in like Shanghai and stuff I pulled from a few of the places I've worked. It's been really helpful and enlightening to see everybody's research processes in the industry. Now we're getting into some of those medium shapes and getting into the smaller shapes, these boxes within those cross shapes, those cross beams on this building. And again, a lot of this stuff might seem trivial, right? Like you don't need to do it if you're focusing on the right thing, but this is going to create a little bit of variance for your viewer to look at. When your viewer when your viewer's eye is drifting around the page compositionally, you want them to find things and be like, oh, look at that little detail. I didn't even notice that before. And it's like little Easter eggs that you're going to plant in there. And again, it's got to have a clear read for the main thing, but afterwards you can start putting in these smaller details and secondary reads. And it's almost like a painting within a painting where you're giving the viewer something else for their eye to look at and drift around before coming back to the main idea of your painting. And again, all this is in support of that robot. Again, he's still the star. He's still got the darkest and lightest values on him. A lot of the value structures here, it's pretty simple. I'm keeping my sky in the background the lightest thing, and then as things move forward in space, they're getting darker because there's not a strong, sunlight or directional light in this image yet. And I don't think there will be towards the end. There might be a little bit in the foreground, but there's not. I keep it pretty ambiently lit for this painting, just because I want you guys to focus on value structures first, and we can start talking about extreme differences in lighting scenarios later on. Right there, you'll see some green coming back in, that kind of neon streaming green. And again, this is the opposite of that red base that I had, and that red and orange coming into the painting. And that kind of contrast is always welcome for me in color variation. Over here, I've just extended the canvas on the right side, and what's really awesome about extending the canvas, I just used the crop tool, dragged it right a little bit till my robot moved and shifted a little bit towards more third center. And that building on the right allows me to light it, with the same lighting that the robot's getting from the front. And it really, for me, helps tie those two things together, and it sets up that foreground and middle ground relationship. And then we've got the background as almost like a separate entity. It's so far away in the distance, and it's getting so much atmosphere that it's unable to pick up this directional light that's in the foreground. One thing that's hard, especially in environments, and especially when you're just kind of painting freely like this, is you get bogged down in perspective. And I'm not a stickler for perspective. I'm a fan of, if it looks correct, it is correct. So if it's believable, it's good enough, especially for a painting like this that I'm just staying pretty loose and rough. And in the foreground, I readjusted that roof because the horizon was actually lower than it should have been for it, so just shifted that around. And you can see I'm even struggling a little bit more compositionally here, having to add another middle ground element on the left side and covering up some of the detail I did earlier, and that's okay. You're going to lose parts of your painting. It's all part of the process. What matters is the end result. Does the end result work, or does it not? And as long as you're working towards that, that's the main part of painting. You want a good end result. You don't want to spend a bunch of time on one thing and then realize that it's going to get covered up, or you're going to lose that part of the painting to bad composition. So just make good choices early on, and as long as you can recognize them, you'll start to develop that taste and be able to use them later on. Here I'm blocking in some silhouettes, so I've just dropped a white layer and then dropped the opacity on it so I can draw on top of it. And that actually brings me to a really good point, which is the structure of a painting. The most important thing is a drawing. I'd say drawing accounts for about 60% of what a good painting is, because if your structure's off, if your proportions are off, if your perspective's off, some of those basic fundamental drawing skills are awry, then it doesn't matter how well you paint, how beautiful your brushstrokes are, or your value structures. If they're spot on, if the drawing's off, it's never going to look right. So you want to make sure your drawing's correct, right? So I took the time to just draw those figures in quickly, and then your values are the next step. So I'm putting in a dark value for that skin tone, a dark pink, and then putting a light side in with that light pink. And again, it's all about the dark and light sides and simplifying everything down to, you know, almost two values. And then I think Vincent's demo was really helpful with that still life that he broke down. You know, you can break everything down to the dark and light side, and then you can start showing those values in between afterwards. In the case of these two foreground guys, you know, it's tempting to do that, you know, stick salesman thing and not pose them, just to have them there for scale or something. But I tried to give them a little bit of pose, you know, with their arms up or just lounging. And I put a little girl up there because she's going to be adorable in the final painting. I don't get to it in this version of it. You know, I just cut the demo short, about I think it was like 2 hours in or something, and you're able to see that I'm just getting to a middle stage almost. Um, so here, what I'm doing is I'm blocking in. I'm tying the whole painting together with an overlay layer. So I've used that yellow. You saw me experimenting with a blue as well, just to see what would happen. And that's the great thing about Photoshop. You can do pretty much anything, and you can Command Z and go backwards. So I tried the blue, didn't work out. Switched back to yellow, gave it an overlay layer, and then dropped the opacity on it just to bring. It's almost like adding a glaze of yellow wash on top of the whole painting. After that, put a color dodge layer on, and that color dodge in yellow, again, yellow-orange, is kind of like establishing the foreground lighting that I'm using, that directional light in the foreground. And then on top of that, I put a multiply layer with a dark brown, and that's bringing all the shadows back, and that's why the painting looks a lot darker right now. For the lights in the background, what I did was just put you know, pinpoints of a solid 100% of the red or yellow color, and then a color dodge layer with a big soft brush, and you can see that right there. I'm adding even more atmosphere by just using a bigger, softer brush to ghost and wash those lights in there. As for the atmosphere, the background got a little bit too dark, so I switched to black and white and dropped into black and white with an adjustment layer. So that's a black and white half circle. Go to hue saturation, drop the saturation all the way down. It'll take it to grayscale. You can check your values. And I lightened up the background with, you know, a few lighten layers. And you can see the final painting just has really strong values in the foreground, and then it gets lighter and lighter as it goes back. And again, that's that ambient light, very simple structure that I was talking about. And hopefully you guys found this helpful. If you guys have any other questions, please don't be afraid to ask. And if you guys have work that you want to show me, please reach out. The last thing I wanted to say is make sure you focus on those drawings, and then your values, and then your colors afterwards. And so it's a lot to take in all at once, but if you simplify to the big, medium, and small shapes, and the 1, 2, 3 reads, you'll do super well. So good luck, and show me what you got. Thanks.